Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. We start off by saying that generosity matters. Generosity is something that all of us want to cultivate. It's one of the virtues. It's one of the things that as a Christian, as a person of faith, as a good person in this world, we want to cultivate generosity. It's not the only thing, of course. We cultivate love, we cultivate compassion, justice, kindness, courage, all of these other virtues that we want to incorporate into what it means to be a person in this world, but generosity is in there in the mix. And when you talk about generosity, yes, you can talk about giving your time, yes, you can talk about giving your talent and other things like that, but if you're going to talk about generosity, you got to talk about money too, because money represents, for better or for worse, in this world, so much of who we are. It represents so much of our time that we trade in exchange for money. And it represents our 2 decades of education, usually, that we trade in exchange for money. It represents the time we'd rather be spending with family or doing other things, but we do a job so we can get some money, right? We do all of this. It's our passion, it's our skill, it's our vocation, and it's all sort of symbolized in our income. And unfortunately, in this world, there's tremendous income disparity that's not based on any real value that God places on the work that we're doing. It's also messed up, but that's another sermon. That was if we're going to be thoughtful and intentional and faithful and holistic then about growing as people of faith, then we're going to have to talk about giving, and we're going to have to talk about money. The biblical assumption about giving money and giving resources is tithing. Now, I don't think it's a commandment. Some people say the Bible commands that you give a tithe, which is 10% of your income. I think it's an assumption. I think that if you read Old Testament, New Testament, it's just assumed that that's the appropriate amount that people are supposed to give away, is at 10%. Now that feels like a stretch for many people today, to give 10% of your income away. There are so many things that compete for that piece of the pie that is our annual income. For folks who are in lower income brackets, it's things like housing, like just having adequate, safe housing takes a huge chunk of a person's income, maybe probably more than it did back in the day when the Bible was written. I don't know, that's hard to gauge. But housing today takes this huge portion. And so people are competing with, I want to make sure I have safe housing for myself and my family. Healthcare takes this huge and increasing portion today. And then if you are a person or people who are in higher income brackets, there's other things that start to compete for your money. It's never like you get more and more money and now you just have more and more to give away. It's always like somebody else wants a piece of that pie. For many people in upper income brackets who have kids, they want to say, well, I want my kid to have the absolute best education that they can and the best opportunities that they can, and that means, or might mean for me, private school. That's going to compete and take a chunk of that income away from what could potentially be given. Vacations. Somehow when you get more and more money, your vacations get more and more extravagant. When I was a kid, back in my day, when I was a kid, our vacation was, we drove from Florida to Washington, D.C. to stay for a week in my grandmother's 2-bedroom condo with me and my mom and my 3 brothers. That's vacation. Today, if you've got enough for it, all of a sudden it's like, well, it really has to be a house on the beach or it's not a vacation, right? And so that's $10,000 a week. Am I hitting it? Is any of this true? So there's all of this competing for our income, which is why I think it's helpful to talk instead about it's either tithing or nothing, or it's either tithing or you're wrong, to say what we want to do is make tithing a goal and think in terms of proportional giving. Proportional giving is how much, if we take our income and look at that holistically, how much of that do we feel called, do we feel joyful about giving away? So let's start with some examples. Let's say you're bringing in, netting 60,000, That's what goes into your bank account, $60,000 a year. We can argue about whether you should do this before taxes or after taxes or healthcare or whatever. Let's just say whatever check goes into your bank account. Let's say that's 60,000. What's 10% of 60,000? Yes, that's one good thing about tithing. The math is very easy, right? So that's about $500 a month. So if you're tithing an income of $60,000, you're giving about $500 a month. Now let's say you're like, yeah, no way. I'm not going to do. I can't. So you're going to say, well, what's 5%? 5% of 60,000 is 3,000 a year, 250 a month. Let's say I can't even do that. There's too much going on in my life. I have too many obligations. 2%. What's 2% of 60,000? $1,200 a year, $100 a month, or 1%. Whatever you need to figure out, but it's worth it to figure it out. I like to say generosity, in terms of money, is one of the only virtues you can figure out with a calculator, right? You can't figure out how much love you have with a calculator or how much compassion you have, but you can figure out how much money you're giving away. So you figure that out, and then you say, okay, but my goal at some point is to reach 10%. That's the kind of person I want to be. I want to be a person that lives on 90% of my income and gives 10% away at least. And so you work toward that. And maybe you're giving 2% this year, and next year you're going to try to go for 3%, and the next year 4%, or whatever, however you want to figure it out. The other way to go about this, of course, is the biting the bullet philosophy, where you just say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to give 10%, and I'm going to live on 90%, and I'm going to figure out how to live on 90%. And that's going to affect my housing choices, my vacation choices. Everything else is going to be affected because that's non-negotiable. And there are people who do that, and God bless those people. That's the give what's right and not what's left philosophy, right? You figure out 10% and you figure out the rest later. One question, this is going to be a short sermon, I'm just going to wrap this up, but people often will say, well, is it only giving to the church? Like, what about my other charitable giving? What if I want to give to healthcare for the homeless? What if I want to give to migrants on the border? Honestly, this is all between you and God, really. I mean, whatever I say. But I would say that the teachings about giving are not really about what the church needs, but more about what we need as people. That we need to try to be generous as people. That it's about cultivating our own generosity. And if you give 5% to migrants on the border, or healthcare for the homeless, and 5% to the church, I don't think God's going to have a problem with that. I don't know for sure, but it sounds okay. However, if we are members of a church, if you're like, this is my church community, I believe in this church, and I believe when you are part of a church community, what you're saying is, I believe that tending to people's souls and tending to people's faith has a ripple effect on the world. And so, yes, I want to give because people are hungry, but I also want to give in a way that changes the conversation about what's happening in this world. And so if you're a member of a church, I think church should be in the top 2 or 3 of the recipients of your giving, of that 10%, but up to you. The last thing I'll say is that Jesus doesn't talk about tithing very much, but he does talk about tithers once. And the only time he talks about tithers, he's critical of them. So this is a little warning about not getting too high on your high horse if you're giving a tithe, okay? In Matthew 23:23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You tithe mint and dill and cumin." So you tithe the lightest, tiny bits of the lightest thing, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. You should have done those without neglecting the other. So if you're tithing, God bless you, but it doesn't ensure you a box seat in heaven, okay? There's a lot of work that we have to do as people of faith, all the virtues that we're trying to cultivate to be the people that God calls us to be, and generosity is one of those things. It's part of the mix. And the way we go about being thoughtful and intentional with making generosity part of the mix is through proportional giving. intentionally doing the math, figuring it out on a calculator, and setting a goal for where you want to be as a person. Start where you can, start where the giving feels good and joyful, and then seek to grow. Ask God to help you grow, to make you more and more generous. Always, always remembering to never neglect justice, mercy, and faith. Amen.